Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 628th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Dr. Mark Epstein, Helen Tworkov, and Reverend Dr. Donna Schaper. We're thrilled to welcome poet Suchi Pritchard here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, and that here in New York, we're on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for actual necessary decolonial work, but a reminder of place of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustained and enriched the stolen land that we speak from. And now today, it's my pleasure to introduce the guests and host. Psychiatrist Dr. Mark Epstein is in private practice in New York City and the author of a number of books about the interface of Buddhism and psychotherapy, including the Zen of Therapy, Uncovering a Hidden Kindness in Life, published in 2022 by Penguin Press. Helen Tworkov is Tricycle's founding editor and author of Zen in America, Profiles of 5 Teachers. She's also the co-author of several books, including In Love with the World, A Monk's Journey Through the Bardos of Living and Dying, co-authored with Mingyur Rinpoche. Community builder Reverend Dr. Donna Schaper served as senior minister of Judson Memorial Church from 2006 to 2021. She was formerly at Coral Gable Congregational Church in Miami, and before that at Yale University, and teaches leadership at the Hartford Seminary. She is passionately concerned about leaving the next generation well prepared for all they have to face. She has written over 35 books and is an editor at large at the Rail. And with that, it's my pleasure to pass it over to Donna.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see you and to be doing my first time with Chloe. So welcome aboard. I know you've been here for a while, but you and I haven't been on the same screen. So it's great to see you. Welcome also to a conversation that is going to be fundamentally about Buddhism and ancillarily about spirit, negotiation, magazines, therapy, healing, and what in the name of heaven this world is going to do without all of those things, alive and well. It's my personal hope that you leave this conversation more grounded, more optimistic, and full of ideas and of hope. And with that, I'm going to turn to Mark first, because he brought up the hope word right away in our earlier short conversation. And I was saying to him and also to Helen, you know, what makes Buddhism important to you? And Mark said, it gave me my life and it gave me my hope. Those are pretty big sentences, and I'd like him to say more about that right now.
I don't know how much more I can say in any kind of cogent way, but when you asked me, 10 minutes ago, what was important about Buddhism for me, the first thing that came out of me was that it gave me my life and it gave me hope for myself in the world. And then I've turned around and 40 years or so, 50 years have gone by since I was first exposed to Buddhism. I became a therapist and somehow incorporated what I learned first from being involved with Buddhism into my life as a therapist, and allowed me to bring some of that hope, I think, into my interactions with the various people who have crossed my path. So somehow something came down to me that has informed my life and allowed me to live this life without despair, given the state of the world that we're in.
Yes. May I ask you what your guide was before you found Buddhism?
Oh, it was my freshman year in college that I found Buddhism. So I always say I didn't know much about anything before I found Buddhism. And that was enough.
So you were an empty, if open vessel.
Yeah, I was an empty, if open vessel. I only found Buddhism because my first week in college, I met a girl who was taking an Introduction to World Religion class, and it had never occurred to me to take any such class. But I thought, oh, that'll satisfy a requirement, and I followed her into the Introduction to World Religion. And the first semester was Eastern religion, and the second semester was Western religion. And the Buddhist text in the Eastern religion class was the Dhammapada. And there was a section in the Dhammapada entitled Mind that, spoke to me as if it was written right now, instead of 2,500 years before, and made me conscious of my own mind, and that there was something that maybe I could do to ameliorate the pressures that my mind was putting me under.
Yeah, yeah. So, Helen, how did you find Buddhism, or how did Buddhism find you? At what stage in your life?
Let's see, I was in Asia when I was quite young. I took off for Japan and then Nepal. And this was in 1964, 65. I was 22, 23 years old. And before that, I had really very, very little exposure to Buddhism. A few things. I had done some psychedelics, and that kind of oriented me east. And I was very, very, what had a big impact on me was the Vietnamese monk, Thich Quang Duc, the self-immolation in 1963. And I didn't understand it. I think like a lot of kids, Mark would maybe know more about this than I do, but it seems to me that a lot of us, even when we're very little, begin to intuit that what the world we're being raised in, or the consensus reality around us, isn't quite the whole story, but we just don't know what to do with that. There's just nobody around to help us figure out other ways. And every time we think that there might be out there, we're basically either come to the conclusion on our own, or we're told that we're crazy, or we're somehow out of sync with what's going on, or we're dragged to therapists, as I certainly was when I threatened to get kicked out of high school unless I went into therapy. So then I was in Asia, and I worked with Tibetan refugees in 1965. And that was enormously important to me, because this was a very, very raw situation. These people were just crossing the Himalayas and getting out of China, and their siblings and families and monks and nuns were being beaten and tortured and killed, and monasteries were being down and burnt down, and the sadness, but there was a lot of joy. And it never occurred to me that you could hold that much sadness and that much joy together. I just didn't know about that. I had no religious background. I had no religious education, but I was raised Jewish. I was aware of the Holocaust, and I kind of, I'm sorry? I kind of felt that would define you forever. So the combination of being happy and sad at one time was huge, big piece of information for me, but I couldn't study. I didn't practice for another 10 years.
Wow. And you said something earlier that I will not forget, that it's about negotiating the world. It's a way of negotiating the world towards sanity. And I think that sanity might be well defined as being able to hold joy and sadness together, and not be afraid of either of them. And I want to pick up on psychedelics, but I think I'll ask Mark to say, is it a unity of joy and sadness, or is it a complexity of joy and sadness? What is it?
You can think about it either way. I think I tend to think of it as a unity of joy and sadness, or even from the psychoanalytic, psychotherapist perspective, a unity of anger and love. More the way that I think about it. That a lot of people in the spiritual world, still have an aversion to anger, and haven't really figured it out. You know, it's difficult to figure out. But one of the things I've learned from being a therapist is how intertwined aggression or anger or frustration is with the opening of the heart, with love. And that somehow we have to come to terms with our own internal aggression in order to really be able to love. And that's something that therapy can help with, just as meditation, I think, in the right hands, or done with that vision, can also help with.
And so often when terrible things happen to innocent people, like in the Holocaust, or like what happened to many Tibetan refugees, or like what's happened to school children in a small town in Texas. When terrible things happen, the response is to love so hard that you get furious. And then what are you supposed to do with that? You know, where do you put it? And I like that you said unity. And I'm also like that Helen brought up the word psychedelics. There's so much new work going on about psychedelics and what they offer to us in terms of a unified perspective. And I read somewhere, and you both would know more about this than I would. Sorry, somebody came in here into my private room. Now I'm angry. I'll ask them to go. I read that one of the things the psychedelics do is to dampen the part of the brain that separates things from each other and increases the part of the brain that unifies things. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And just parenthetically, many clergy, including myself, were invited to participate in a study of psychedelics at Johns Hopkins so that we could be researched about whatever sacred mystical experiences we had had without drugs, and then to look at the ones we had with drugs. And I tried so hard to get into the program, but in fact, there is, in truth, a lot of mental illness in my family, and I was rejected. And I thought I would be absolutely perfect. To say more about this unity that it comes either chemically or spiritually. I'm so interested, either one of you.
Well, I would ask Helen. I think Helen has some interesting insights into the relationship of psychedelics and Buddhist practice. I don't know if you do, Helen, you don't have to, but for so many people of our generation and of our milieu, psychedelics were a kind of portal or doorway
Yes.
into the world of meditation practice, because people, touched some either underlying reality, or the possibility, as Helen was saying at the beginning, that we sort of know that the reality we're fed isn't the only one, but we don't have language for what might be behind the scrim, and psychedelics sort of opened that a little bit. So it's been interesting for me to see it come around again, people rediscovering it. I sort of have a thing about the brain, people saying they understand what psychedelics do by, opening this part of the brain, or a lot of that feels to me like it's made up rather than actually based on the science, but that might just be me. But I would try to get Helen to say something about the Buddhist world and the psychedelic world and how they've overlapped over time, because I know you've thought about it, Helen.
Well, I would say that a lot of people from my age, I'm almost 80, definitely entered the Buddhist path through psychedelics. There's no doubt about that. My own experience is a little bit more circuitous, because I did not actually buy into the psychedelic movement. I first took drugs with Leary and Alpert. I got them through Leary and Alpert, so they were they were Sandoz variety, top of the line. But I never really became more than a day tripper with drugs. I never accepted that was reality. I always And at the same time, I never forgot those experiences, and they played a huge role later on in my meditation practice. Years later, I could have experiences in meditation and go, oh, that's what that was about. I could put it together in a way that I could not do when I was younger. So when I was 20 years old and fooling around with acid, it just, there were some terrific experiences, but I never actually said, oh, this is reality. That other thing that I was doing, that life I was leading, that's not real. And I was also the possibility that LSD introduces you to, that the me that is, that we call the self, might not be the whole story. It might not be the self. That was very threatening to me. I didn't want to know that. And I was not ready for that kind of existential assault on the ego. Not at all. So, so I had all kinds of ways of having a good time and then dismissing the information. But as I said, it became important later. And of course, the experiences, I think, at the time in the 60s and 70s, the way it kind of segued and met and combined with the counterculture is very different than the kind of work that's going on now in a lot of universities and hospitals with all kinds of psychedelic, or what do you call them? I don't know what the generic word is.
Well, there's so many kinds. I was in the chat, someone wants to know, I was referring to mushrooms. That's the only thing I know about. But the whole question of what the portal or entry point is to, Helen's mentioned it now twice, both as a child, where she said, I knew there was more going on here than they were saying, but I didn't know what it was. And now again, to say that meditation opens you to this extra reality. And someone said to me once that they thought all of spirituality was about the question more, or is there something more that I'm not seeing or experiencing? And that powerful focus of meditation, at least for me, and I'm not much, you know how everybody says, I'm not a really good gardener, well, I'm not a really good meditator, or I'm not a good cook, or whatever that means. It is the reach for more, for some way to say that there are realities about which I am not acquainted. Just not acquainted.
I think you could also frame it as it's a reaching for less, though.
That's fun. That's fun.
You know, like the Buddhist idea of emptiness.
Yes.
When I've heard Bob Thurman talk about emptiness, he says, well, fullness was already taken in the time, you know, like the religious culture of South Asia in that time, they already had fullness, but the Buddha came along and you know, needed a way to frame his insights. And emptiness, you know, the Sanskrit word for emptiness is shunyata, which is derived from a syllable that actually means the swelling, like the swelling of a seed. So it's like the emptiness of a pregnant womb, not a emptiness, you know. So, but the reaching for the less than, that the self isn't as, you know, pronounced, as ultimate, as clear as we want it to be, you know. One of the things that psychedelics did for me was to lead me to Ram Dass in his early incarnation as Ram Dass, who would always say, you're not who you think you are, you know, and just that phrase is one of the things I always remember from him. That was very meaningful to me when all I thought I was what I thought, you know. So to have the sense that there was a way past my thoughts into something more fundamental about myself that was also less than, gave me a kind of freedom, that, like, because I never felt like I was really enough, you know. And that's the common thing that people come to therapy with, a common kind of feeling.
I can't remember which poet said it, but one of the poets that said it was Carlos Williams, I think. My life is being measured out in tiny teaspoons, dripping
Yes,
away.
Elliot.
Elliot,
Yes,
thank
Elliot.
you. Thank you. And so less of the bullshit and more of the goodness, and less of distractions, more of fullness, less of the penultimate and more of the ultimate. And the spiritual awareness that there's more there than meets the eye, as the folk saying would put it.
Or the Buddhist vision that the ultimate and the everyday are actually one.
Yes,
You know,
yes.
rather, so it's not really that you need less of the everyday and more of the ultimate, but that the ultimate is there in the everyday, only we can't see it normally, you know. So for me, it's been more that way of thinking.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's perfect. You know, queer theology has been teaching us to just be careful about every single false binary there is. So calling the everyday the ordinary is really disrespectful to the everyday.
True. Well, there's Freud had a famous statement that the best he could do for someone with psychoanalysis was to take them from a state of neurotic misery and return them to one of common unhappiness.
Yes.
And I always use that then to say, well, Buddha had a different, you know, that there was something you could do to get past common unhappiness. But then I started to think that maybe common unhappiness, like a real acceptance of common unhappiness, is the Buddha's vision. You know,
Yeah,
that the ultimate comes through your own common unhappiness. That's
right.
a portal in its own way.
Yes, yes. So how do you, either of you, feel about the terms that try to blend Buddhism with other things, a Jubi or engaged Buddhist, or any of these, how shall I put it, mixtures, you know, where people say they're a mixture. I mean, I only say I'm a Christian because I'm a cradle Christian. I don't really think that I'm any more or less than that. And I would love to be, I'll say I've gone Zen if I, you know, and end up saying I'm not going to say anything. Is that a shibboleth or is that a cliche? What about the cliches around Buddhism?
Well, I personally don't care about those labels at all. I've been told that I'm not a Buddhist. That's fine. I've been told
really?
that the traditions that I'm in, primarily Tibetan Buddhism and Zen, are not Buddhist because they're off the charts from the original Buddhist teaching. So I don't care about any of that. I don't really care whether I'm perceived of as a Buddhist or not a Buddhist.
Well,
you know, I could be too crazy to be a Buddhist. It doesn't mean anything to me. It's just another label to get rid of. As far as the things you refer to, I think, you know, as long as you're working towards some understanding of how your mind works and how you can ease your life through whatever work you're doing, I think it's fine. I don't it feels okay.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer. You know, people tell you, you know, my husband is Jewish, my children are raising their 3 children Jewish, and they go to Israel, and my son Isaac and his wife Sarah, who is a rabbi, are told that they're not really Jewish because of me, and they just walk away. And I think that's the only thing to do, is to say thank you for sharing and be done with it. Labels.
People have a thing about how many Western Buddhist teachers are Jewish. And
yeah, people do have a thing.
They have a thing about that.
Right.
And so the whole Jubu thing, you know, people they want to understand what it is about Judaism that has brought people to Buddhism. And mostly it's like, it has nothing to do with Judaism whatsoever. It's that those of many of us who were born Jewish were raised really without any spiritual sense and no religion, nothing from Judaism. So maybe that created a kind of searching. But I always talk about it as saying that the Jews were always the translators between traditions, because they were moving always, from place to place. So now
Yes.
it just happens to be
Yeah.
thought that the Jews are the messengers of. But
Mhm.
I
So,
back away from the labels, like Helen.
mhm. So using more labels, and forgive me because I don't have another language for it. How evangelical are you about Buddhism?
Well, as a therapist, I make it a point not to be trying to convert anybody, or even
Yeah.
teach them to
Yeah.
meditate, or
Uh-huh.
I don't except that I've written all these books about Buddhism. I don't
Right.
advertise the Buddhist thing. But for other therapists, I'm very evangelical. I think there's something in Buddhism that has reinvigorated psychoanalysis. So I think it could be of great help to a lot of therapists to look inside their minds and see what they find.
Well, I mean, I have to say, the word evangelical implies forced and lack of consent, telling other people what to do. I've read one of your books and appreciated it so much, and it's very invitational, and it offers a gift. It isn't forcing anything on anyone.
Well, I always think that I'm just trying to translate Buddhist
Uh-huh.
ideas into psychoanalytic language, which is sort of like the language of the mind in our culture.
Right. And I feel the same way, Helen, about Tricycle, which I love as a magazine. It's very invitational. It's not, again, all these stereotypes, ideological, evangelical, forced, opinionated. It's not that.
Donna,
One,
ask Helen about working with Mingyur Rinpoche, because she wrote this whole book. She wrote
I
this.
hereby ask.
Okay.
You ask.
Oh, no, I don't, like the audience might not know, but they might not know. Like, you collaborated with this youngish Tibetan Lama, telling an incredible story about renouncing his robes and becoming an ascetic and almost dying. And then you wrote the book with him. Tell us what that was like.
Could you make that a little bit more specific, Mark? What is it you want to know?
I really want to know what the writing, like what the back and forth of what the collaborative thing was like between a Rinpoche, a Lama, and you, like what that experience was like creatively. It's really what I want to know about. But his story is pretty interesting if you just want to tell his story.
Well, the story is that this young Lama, this young Tibetan who was raised as a kind of a hothouse orchid, because this comes from a sort of Dharma royalty family in the Kathmandu Valley. So he was raised with kid gloves, and he grew up in a very rarefied Dharma atmosphere. It was very well taken care of, always with attendants. He had never been outside alone. As a tulku in the Tibetan terms is someone who's identified as reincarnation of a previous Lama or a previous being who had some high degree of realization. So he was recognized as a tulku in two different traditions. So part of the tulku system is you're never allowed to be alone. You're never allowed to be outside. You're always extremely protected. And so he grew up, he was in a 3-year retreat. He was sort of a very precocious, brilliant young student. When he was 16 years old, he went into a second 3-year retreat, of which he was the retreat master, because his own teacher at that point, Taisita Rinpoche, was traveling in the West. So that was a very unusual situation for somebody that young to be in that position. His father was a very well-known, great meditation teacher named Tukul Urgan Rinpoche. And he was, because through his reincarnation, he was the abbot of a monastery inside Tibet, which he sort of somewhat secretly visited at some point in his life. He had a monastery in Nepal and a monastery in India, in Bihar. So when he was about 33 years old, I'm going to get these dates right. In any event, he told everybody, including me and many other students, that he was going to go into a secluded 3-year retreat. And that's all he said about it. This was in 2012, something like that. And everybody assumed he was going to go into a monastery, or, you know, there are many places throughout the northern Himalayas where there are sort of retreat huts above monasteries where the monks in the monasteries can take care of those monks that are in retreat huts. So you're isolated more or less, but people bring you food and you have that kind of protection and comfort. And everybody assumed that he would be doing something like that, either within his own monasteries or other monasteries. But in fact, what he did is he slipped out of his monastery in the middle of the night, telling absolutely nobody, and had a plan to live on the street for the next 3 years. It turned out it was 4.5 years. So he had no passport. He had a little bit of money when he left the monastery. But basically, he went from being this prince to being a free person, and sort of overnight. And he had spent a lot of time fantasizing about what this might feel like. But the fact is that the minute he left the monastery, he had a little freak out right away. He just realized, like, oh my God, what have I done? You know, it's like that David Byrne moment, you know, like, oh my God, what have I done? And so he has a very rough time initially. And then 3 weeks into his 4.5-year retreat, he uses the last of his money to keep buying little bits of food here and there and staying in hostels that are basically used for pilgrims, very, very cheap. And he's in Kushinagara in northern India, which is actually the place where the historical Buddha died. And he begs for food for the very, very first time. And he's given the leftovers that is scraped into a pot from various paying customers. And he's come in the back door of the kitchen. He's given a bowl of these leftovers, and he gets very sick right away. And he spends the next several days, there's a lot of vomiting and diarrhea, and he's getting dangerously dehydrated, which is what the part that he doesn't really quite get right away. I mean, I don't know that he ever actually understood that. Later on, we learned that he was extremely dehydrated. And he comes very, very close to dying. And there is a moment where he experiences that separation of mind and body that the Tibetan literature tells us does happen at the very end. Somehow he comes back, and that's a kind of very peculiar part of the story, because you can't really describe how that happens or why it happens. It just happens. And then he comes back, he continues on his retreat, and he comes out of retreat and is very interested in writing about this series of teachings that all the Tibetans learn called the Bardo teachings. And these are the teachings about life and death. And this is what he wants to write about. And that's the book that we worked on together. And the process is that I would spend a month or two, maybe 3 months at the most, with him in mostly between his monasteries in Nepal and India. And I would ask questions and he would answer them. And then I would work on sentences, paragraphs, pages, and I'd read them back to him. And this went on for 2-3 years. And I think, you know, one of the things about the book that people comment on is that he's very open about his own emotional life in this book in a way that many Tibetans are not, and generally shy away from. And some of that is my own life as an American post-Freudian person. I ask questions that, for example, his Chinese students would never have asked.
Right.
So that's the kind of a component that, you know, it would take an American to ask the questions that even French monastics around him would not have asked those same questions. But they were not unusual for an American. Like, you know, well, this and this and this happened. Well, Rinpoche, how did that feel? You know, those are not questions that the Tibetans will tell you easily. So that's how that book came about. Does that answer your question, Mark?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting answer, that last part to my question. I didn't know that. And that makes total, in terms of this topic of the bridging of Freud and Buddha, you know, that you pulled that out of him, it makes the book so alive. And I heard an interview that he gave just the other week, maybe, with Dan Harris on the 10% Happier podcast thing that Dan Harris does. And it was titled, a Tibetan Lama talks about his panic attacks, talks about how to deal with panic.
Right.
One of the things about Mingyur is that he admits to having a lot of anxiety when he was a boy and a young man. And he gave such a refreshingly intimate and interesting interview with Dan Harris. It really surprised me because he was so actually open and forthcoming, but used it as a teaching, as a Dzogchen teaching, you know, like he talked about when you're in a room that has a light, if you look at the light bulb, you know, like you can see the source of light, but how hard is it to be in the room and see the light everywhere? You know, just to see the light's invisible, but how can we be aware of it? That's what being aware of awareness is like. And I thought, oh, what a good, you know, what a good metaphor. And he talked about how his father would tell him to treat the panic like any other meditation object, and he would try to do that, but secretly in the back of his mind, he was like, "Go away, panic, go away." And then his father would say, "Okay, make the aversion to the panic the object of your meditation," you know. And he had a very deliberate and yet open way of talking about everything. I thought, like, where did this? So I could see maybe the conversations with you over the couple of years and writing the book had helped to open him in this way that we value as, you know, post-Freudian.
But Mark, also in terms of translations, you know, he had started coming to America as a very young man. He was in his early 20s. And so, and his father attracted a lot of Western students. So he went into the monastery when he was 11. He started his monastic training young, but before that he had been around a lot of Westerners. Then he came in his early 20s. He was kind of more attuned and had an opportunities to become more familiar with the Western mind and Western attention to emotional material than some of the older Tibetans who completely didn't get it at all. So I think that was
nice.
I remember I had a conversation with his brother, Sukni Rinpoche, about 20 years ago. I did a retreat with him, and I had one conversation with him that was about the feeling of unworthiness that Westerners carry, you know, with them into their meditation practice. And it was at the beginning of Sukni Rinpoche teaching a lot of Westerners, and he was very, like, that's what he wanted to know about, you know, like the way we blame our parents for that,
everything.
For everything, yeah. The way we blame our parents for everything. He couldn't understand. He was like, oh, you know, like, because they teach this meditation where you imagine all beings as your mother. And I was like trying to say, like, that's really hard for us, you know. And he was like, oh, okay, like, grandma, but maybe all beings as your grandmother, you know.
Well, there's a very famous exchange with between Sharon Salzberg and the Dalai Lama, in which she asks a question, and I can't remember the details, Mark, but she asks a question, something about, she uses the term self-hatred, I think.
Yeah.
And the Dalai Lama doesn't know what she's talking about. This is about 30 years ago. He doesn't know, and he turns to his translator, like, what is she talking about?
Yeah.
And the translator has to sort of explain this term that, you know, of course, every Westerner in the audience is more than a little familiar with. And he's just kind of sitting there shaking his head.
No, he goes around, all the Western Buddhist teachers are there, and he goes around and he asks each one of them, do you have this? Do you have this? And they all say yes. And he's like, yeah.
Wow. Wow. Well, now I have an opening to the question of sanity, Helen, and this sanity of being able to be whole in the midst of devolution and difficulty. And I won't answer the question, I'll just ask it. I wonder how you all here, how much trouble do you think we're really in as a society? And
a lot.
how is that? What did you say? Sorry?
A lot.
Yeah.
Huge.
Well, I think so too. And I worry about our children so much, what it must be like to go to school. And I don't think I have much self-hatred left, in the same sense that I think I've lost all the innocence I started with. So I'm in a more empty place, but I feel like I'm living inside a major ongoing unfurling tragedy all around me. And I'm not worried about what I would call God. You know, I really am not. I think some of you know that I was saved young by a Lutheran pastor in Kingston, New York, who came to my house when my father was beating up my mother and stopped the violence. And I had this belly level faith in God and church. Of course, the beating didn't stop, but at least there was an adult in the room from then on. And that was huge to me. So I can't not distrust the divine. And I know that everybody doesn't get an answer to their phone call, but I did. And it made huge amounts of difference in what I think of as an unshakable faith. However, it's shaking. I'm shaking a lot these days about what's happening. I'll never believe that Trump was allowed to be president. I just won't believe it, but I think it happened. Maybe it was in my nightmares. And here we are. So you said something very important earlier, Helen, for me at least, that Buddhism was allowing you to negotiate your way with these difficulties towards something like sanity. And so I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, I have certainly had my days and my hours of total despair about what's going on in the United States. So I'm not going to pretend that it's, I have an ongoing, ebullient, joyful, resilient relationship to what's happening.
Yes, right.
But I do think that Dharma, Buddhist practice, and meditation practice, as always, it gives you a bigger reality. It's not a different reality. There's only one reality. There is this very common thing in Buddhism talking about ultimate reality and relative reality and true reality. Those are all, there is one reality. That's the reality that we're all in together. There's only one reality. But it certainly is a lot bigger than what most of us experience day by day or hour by hour. And I think that so even with everything that's pretty awful going on, even that is within a bigger reality. So so that's one way of being helped with Dharma practice. I think that another way is that there's always a way to turn adversity into some kind of ally. And no matter what it is, there's always a way to do that. If you can look for the way, if you have confidence that that exists. If you don't have confidence that it exists, you don't look for it and you don't get it. So, for example, I was reading an article in the paper recently by a guy who makes bunkers. So it turns out that his business has increased 400 times in the last year. So we could ask, is that really, is that a sane way to create protection? Now, for some people, obviously it is. What does that give them? But the other thing we could do is to ask, what does that need for protection tell us about our own capacity for love?
Yes.
There's a lot there for us to look at, other than just being, I'm so afraid I'm going to spend $1 billion on this bunker, or $1 million, whatever.
Right.
It turns out there are some relatively cheap bunkers. You sort of like a ladder that you can go down into a very small cave, and you can fit in as many jars of peanut butter as possible.
I knew a guy in Miami who had
like cities. Some of them are like little villages down there. It's extraordinary. But so what is, the questions that, for example, Stephen Hawking raised a long time ago about artificial intelligence and how it has the capacity to annihilate what we call humanity. Well, is that fear of that, is that a new fear, or is that another fear of dying, another version of fear? And is that fear, again, can that be used as looking at a source of our own love and compassion, or loving kindness, or what did you call it, Mark, in your therapy? Kindness?
Yeah, just kindness. Yeah.
Kindness is that, all of these things can be used to explore. But of course, if you stick with just conventional media, it's all told to you in a tone that does nothing but exaggerate fear and dread.
I know.
If you ask them, so they're not going to tell you, what, there's a way to look at this which can make you feel not so despairing, can give you some hope about your own humanity, the people around you. There's that possibility. So it's not just getting locked into fear and anxiety. I've been there. When Trump was elected, I understand about getting fixated, locked into fear and anxiety and revenge and opinions. And boy, it just doesn't go anywhere. It's just a waste. At the end, it's just a terrible waste of energy and time.
Yeah.
Helen, you were talking at the beginning, before we went public, you were talking about, this idea of engaged Buddhism and what kind of political, what change is possible with or without internal work. Can you try to say some version of what you said at the beginning again? I thought it was very strong.
Well, I think anybody who's doing any kind of social activism is doing good work. I mean, everybody should continue whatever they're doing: climate activism, eco-terrorism activism,
Right.
voting activism, whatever it is.
Absolutely.
But I do think that without some kind of personal transformation, we can look at a history of activism and know where it's going. And it's on the repeat button. That without personal transformation, all the good work that we're trying to do is just going to somehow, it's going to come together, fall apart without any really lasting changes. And I think that that's one of the lessons that the United States is showing us right now. That we made some laws, we made some adjustments, but it didn't get the kind of traction that we assumed was there. And we found out how fragile it was. So especially if you look at race, the history of race in America, without more personal transformation, it's very hard to see how things are going to improve greatly.
And you also said that meditation itself was social action, or was action. It's not social action.
No, it's engaged Buddhism. It's a totally engaged full body experience.
Right.
And it's not something that you do on your cushion and then it's just for you and it's your own little thing. And I mean, you get up and you go into the world, and however that works out is who you are and what you're bringing. And you can't keep it to yourself. It's an oxymoron. It's not possible. It's just not possible. It cannot work that way.
Exactly.
Despite 50 years of New Yorker cartoons about gazing at your own navel, it just doesn't work that way.
Right. What's wrong with my navel? You know, who said something bad about my navel? Oh, my goodness. For years, I thought that's where babies came from. I had a very bad sex education. So Mark, you brought some slides and you mentioned earlier about how you were trying to integrate, I think you said Freud, but maybe you meant post-Freud. And how can you be really good friends with Freud and Buddhism? How does that work?
Well, I think just what Helen was describing actually is
Yes.
like a good entry into trying to answer that question.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah, these are some of the pictures that in terms of bringing whatever meditation does or doesn't do for me, bringing that to what it is to be a therapist. It's not like one thing is separate from the other. That's the major point, I think, that whatever meditation has given me, whatever that is, I don't know who I would be without it, but so whatever I've become is what I bring to my role as a therapist. This is a picture taken in Freud's office in London, where he went for the last couple of years of his life, fleeing Vienna. This is a picture of his daughter, Anna, with the silver hair and the pearl necklace, and her longtime companion, Dorothy Burlingham, with whom she lived for 40 years, who was the daughter of Louis Comfort Tiffany of Tiffany Lamps and the Tiffany store. And the Kuan Yin figure, which Freud in the last years of his life started collecting not just Egyptian antiquities, but Chinese and South Asian antiquities. So the very last years of his life, he was drawn to beginning to open to the wisdom of the East. So he himself was seeing the parallels between what he was doing and what meditation might be capable of doing. And I just did a Zoom lecture for the Freud Museum in London, because they just closed a Freud and China show that was focused on these the collection from the last years of his life. And one thing I learned is that Freud had an old man Taoist figure, like a Taoist sage figure, positioned next to his desk chair. And his housekeeper said that every morning when he came in to sit at his desk, he would first bow to the Taoist sage that was sitting right next to him. So I see that as the prelude to the interaction of psychoanalysis and Buddhism, as exemplified in this picture. There might be more photos. I don't know who's running the thing, but we don't. Oh yeah. So,
let's see a few more.
This is taken in 1975 in Boulder, Colorado, when I first, the year after I first met Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield, who those of you who have studied with either of them might recognize them there. And Sharon Salzberg, who many people know now, is here in front looking up at Joseph. And this was taken in Bodh Gaya, which is the village where the famous Bodhi tree, where the Buddha was enlightened. It's become a pilgrimage place, like a little Buddhist oasis in India, where Buddhism was wiped out in India 1,000 years ago, but little bits of it remain. So this is Bodh Gaya, Joseph Goldstein. This is Jack Kornfield, when he reordained as a monk for a couple of weeks in Bodh Gaya when we were all there together in 1977. Another picture of Jack putting his robes on. This is a woman named Deepama who, after her husband died and she was bereft, she came to Bodh Gaya and met a Buddhist teacher, Munindra, who also taught Joseph, and he very quickly guided her in her meditation so that she developed many of the psychic powers that are said to be a side effect of advanced meditation practice. And many of us were lucky enough to know her in the last years of her life. This is Mahasi Sayadaw, a Burmese meditation master who was Joseph Goldstein's teacher's teacher and responsible for articulating the early descriptions of mindfulness practice that have now been, diffused throughout the mental health system in the United States. But he brought it back to life in Burma. And in this early trip in the 70s that these pictures are from, I traveled with Joseph and Jack and Ramdas to Mahasi Sayadaw's monastery in Burma. This is Joseph's teacher, Munindra, who studied with Mahasi Sayadaw. This is Ramdas and various friends at Ajahn Chah's monastery in northern Thailand, the monastery that Jack Kornfield was a monk at for 2 years after being in the Peace Corps in the 70s. Munindra again. Ajahn Chah, who was Jack Kornfield's teacher, Forest Monastery, northern Thailand on the Lao border. I always quote a story he tells about the glass that he knows is already broken. The glass that he loves, that's beautiful, that every minute with it is precious because he knows that it's already broken. A story that he told to us at that time. This is me with Ramdas in Maui at Ramdas's house the year before he died. I think that's all I have.
Those are all the images. I believe Donna has hopped off the conversation, which gives us to a really good moment to ask some of the questions that have come in from the audience. And so first off, I just want to say thank you so much, Helen and Mark and to Donna for that incredible conversation. We do have several questions, which I'll now read. The first one is from our friend GE. So I'm going to unmute GE to ask you directly.
Hello, thank you so much. What a wonderful panel, and I'm so glad this is being recorded. Thank you to the Brooklyn Rail. This is really a question for Mark Epstein. Do you find in your experience practicing psychotherapy that it really fits well with your beliefs as a Buddhist, specifically because Buddhism is so much emphasizes the importance of striving to be of service to others, and also because of the primacy of mind in bringing about happiness or suffering?
Yeah, I found psychotherapy to be a very willing vehicle for Buddhism, and for me in particular as a way of trying to give back or trying to express or trying to bring into life what I've gained, what I've learned, what I've found through my own meditation practice. So I started to see therapy as an interpersonal meditation rather than meditations being only intrapersonal or intrapsychic. When I first I learned about Buddhism and did a lot of retreats, 2-week silent meditation retreats before I went to medical school and before I had any real training in being a therapist. And when you come to being a therapist through medical school, so I'm a psychiatrist, which means I went to medical school, et cetera, they don't really teach you what to do when you're in the room with a patient. You just like one day you're in medical school and you're doing a psychiatry rotation and and you get a patient, and then you go into the room and you're the therapist, you know, and then when you're an intern and then you're a resident, suddenly you're the psychiatrist. And you get a little bit of, you learn about schizophrenia and manic depression, and, you know, maybe a little bit about psychoanalysis when I was training, not so much anymore. But when you're in the room with the patient, you're the doctor, you know? And so I had nothing really to draw on but my own experience in meditation and my own experience in therapy. So I was sort of imitating my own therapist, but also I had the feeling that, oh, I know what I've tried to do for my own mind when I'm meditating. Why don't I try to do that for this person when I'm in the room with them, you know? And that seemed to work, you know, and I was kind of making it up as I went along, but my first patients liked me, you know, or liked whatever was going. So I was encouraged, you know. And that remained. The more I read a lot. So I'm not a psychoanalyst, but I was taught by a lot of good analysts, and I pretend to be an analyst, you know, because I quote Freud and so on. But the more I read about the theory behind psychoanalytic, psychodynamic psychotherapy, the more I saw that, you know, what reflective analysts talked about what they're trying to do was they were trying to bring what I would call a meditative sensibility to the relationship, you know. And from Freud said, suspend your intentions, you know, your expectations, and try to bring impartial attention to everything there is to experience, you know. And from Freud on down, Winnicott and so on, trying to create a holding environment, you know, for emotional experience. It seemed very congruent with what I'd learned from meditation, but meditation had taught me how to do that. In Western training, I you know, if I didn't know, I don't know if I would have found it in the same way. I think a lot of therapists, a lot of psychiatrists, you know, want to have the answer and want to tell you what the problem is. And I was never sure enough of the answer or what the problem was. So I knew I could bring, you know, like, I don't know, you know, I could bring don't know mind to being a therapist. And then sometimes people find the answers within, you know.
Thank you so very much, Mark. Thank you. Oh, wonderful.
Thank you so much for that question, GE. The next question I'm going to ask on behalf of Anna M. in the audience. Anna's question goes back to the beginning of the conversation when we were discussing psychedelics, and says, some people are terrified to use psychedelics to open their minds because they're afraid they won't come back for it. I wonder if that was a concern for either of you as panelists. So it's really directed to both of you.
Won't come back from it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Helen, you want to say anything about that first?
I could certainly understand why that might be a concern. And today, even among many people who are interested, they have many options for various guides. Some of them are, you know, sort of advertise themselves in various ways, or through what Donna was talking about, the program in Baltimore, Maryland Institute, NYU. So I think many people are drawn towards experimenting with these guides as some kind of a security, somebody who's there to help them come back. It wasn't much of a concern of mine, frankly. I don't remember it being a big concern.
I knew some people who didn't come back. You know, I mean, I think there are young people who maybe are predisposed to having a schizophrenic break that get pushed over by their unsupervised or even their attempted supervised psychedelic experiences. I think we're probably at the beginning of seeing the problems that an overzealous a belief in the power of psychedelics can bring. You know, we sort of lived through that already, and it'll probably come around again. but I do think the way that people are being much more careful and trying to use these medicines for their, maybe the spiritual purposes that they're capable of accommodating. Yeah.
No, it does seem like right now it's at a kind of holding pattern of kind of controlled usage.
Yeah.
But it feels to me like it's going to spring out into the street any minute with all of the same problems that there were in the 60s. People are just going to go nuts all over again. It feels that that's almost inevitable. Despite the efforts that many people are making to keep it within a certain framework.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. I have the same feeling.
Thank you so much for those answers. The last question today is going to come from our very own Fong H. Bowie.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, Donna.
So good.
Hi, thank you, Helen. I'm sorry, I'm in between meetings, so I'm driving. But I just stopped just to say hello. And I just want to say that Mark and I have been talking a bit about Vietnamese Buddhism. When I grew up in Vietnam, in the imperial city, Hue, where the Tet Offensive took place in '68, I would go to the Buddhist temple with my grandmother. And for Vietnamese Buddhism, as Helen had mentioned from the beginning, it's really a syncretic religion. In other words, it has total relationship with Vietnamese folk religion, with Chinese spirituality, with Taoism, everything that pertains to everyday life that you kind of hinted on without label. And that's how we were brought up. But the concept of what you are talking in terms of how it spread out into the West and vice versa, I can't help but to think of the Tiananmen Square episode, the Tankman of Tiananmen Square, where we were shocked seeing it, because I think you and I talked about this once when I were talking to Ai Weiwei about this, that somehow it stood out to me, this individual person, presumably a young student carrying his bag on both sides and stopping the advancing tanks of the People Liberation Army in the most important day of China. And you can imagine that would never been, that just never happened. All the religion or theology that been teaching in the East tradition is always trying to get rid of the individual emphasis. And all of a sudden you have this man doing that, and I couldn't help but I perceive him as an Old Testament image, a narrative. It's like Goliath, David against Goliath. So the concept nirvana that Mark and I was talking once about, my grandmother taking me to the Buddhist temple, and there I saw a fresco painted of the Buddha in profile under the Bodhi tree, probably just gotten enlightened. And I think prior, there was Mara sent for his three daughters trying to seduce him, and they all turned into aggressive thousands of arrows attacking him. And behind his shoulder, where he's sitting, lie this thousand of bouquet flower. And I remember asking my grandmother, what was that being conveyed? The aggressive arrow aiming to his body and then turn into a bouquet of flower laying behind his body. And her answer was that they couldn't kill him, grandson, because he's not there. So it brings up to this, this crisis of our world, the liberal hegemony, trying to assimilate and put every other nation, the rest of the world, into the melting pot. It's very upsetting to me, because every culture has its own folklore, their own, traditions, even food, dance, music, and so on. And they might not want to be assimilated. They probably would not want to have McDonald's everywhere in their city. So the question is very simple. I'm sorry, I'm rambling along here. I know that Donna has to go, but I think it's such a difficult thing to convey how powerful the emphasis of Western individuality has become. It's global situation. That's all. That's from my question, and I just asked how you all can mediate with the iconography. Let's say Buddha, an image meditating under the Bodhi tree. It's very impossible to portray him in art because he's not there. Whereas the dramatic potentiality of painting Christ on the cross is so seductive, and it could certainly mobilize with greater effect in art, as we've seen from pre-Renaissance until even today. So I just wanted to see whether you have any response to that idea. Maybe begin with you more.
Yeah,
Donna,
I haven't.
I don't
No,
know.
I want to hear what Helen thinks too. My response is the Buddhist view of selflessness, like what your grandmother said to you. The arrows turn into flowers. Because he's not there. So, but he's doing something to turn the aggression into flowers. Like our own internal violence that is in a way rooted in our attempts to, in our striving for our individuality, because our need to be a separate self in this world where there are billions of others, inevitably we're going to feel that kind of aggression, that diffuses throughout the world. So the Buddhist sense of individuality, the individual self is not all that it's set up to be, not that it doesn't exist at all, but that it doesn't exist the way we imagine it should, is a real counterweight to where the whole culture is going. So and I think that Helen was getting at that earlier about without the internal transformation, no matter what we do, it's going to be the same. So, but I think the Buddhist view of interconnectedness, it's not so simple as in the East, where the whole point is to get rid of the self altogether, and the collective is, the individual self is important, and we have to embody it at the same time, knowing that it doesn't have the ultimate reality that we instinctively want to give it. And so finding that meshing of the two, between existence and non-existence, that I think that there's something very compelling about that for me.
Helen, what do you think?
Well, what's been going through my mind listening to you is something that I started talking about, I think at the very beginning of this discussion. And it had to do with the influence of Kwan Duc, self-immolation. Because, there was a lot of Western press at that event. And they talked about their own horror of watching a human body turn to ash. Nobody talked about how could this person sit there without flinching. Nobody could talk about it because it was absolutely incomprehensible what was going on there. Now, at the time, Diem's people, of course, tried to spread the rumor that he was drugged or he had anesthesia or something that would account for this possibility. I had no idea what had happened. It was impossible to imagine this. Even now, I can't tell you from my own meditation experiences that I understand it. But clearly, he had some capacity to hold that physical pain within his body and not in his mind. He had some capacity there that, this is now me talking 40 years later or whatever, 50, whatever it was, 50, 60 years later. And I still don't understand it, but I have some faith in the possibility of it because of the ways in which he's there and he's not there. And then that's just what Mark was talking about or you were talking about with the flowers. You're there, but you're not there. And what can you do with that? The other thing I wanted to say here is that, you know, it's very tempting when we talk about Buddhism and the evolution of Buddhism, dissemination of Buddhism in the West. You know, it's very tempting to get very carried away with an extremely positive, idealistic, wonderful vision. If we look at so-called Buddhist cultures in Asia, we don't have such a great vision. We don't have such a great vision of the Buddhists in Vietnam during the war. We don't have such a great vision of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. We don't have such a great view of the Buddhists in Burma today, in Sri Lanka. So I don't know what we're talking about here, but I think for me personally, it does come back to personal transformation, because without that, you can have a lot of Dharma and end up with where Sri Lanka is now or Burma. You have Buddhist monks leading the ethnic cleansing against the Rohingya. So that's not a great, that's a very confusing, that's a very, very confusing thing to try to hold and play with or consider.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, I guess what you're describing there, Helen, is what we refer as nirvana, not being there, a piece of burn string, I guess. But I remember also when she meditated, my grandmother, from 4 to 5 every day, she shaved her head. That's why I shave my head like her. I adore her and admire her. And I remember one summer, there was a huge mosquito landed on her bald head. And while she was meditating, and I killed the mosquito, and it did not bother her whatsoever. It did not awaken her, did not surprise her. So the next afternoon, Helen, I snuck in because she wore the Buddhist robe. It's very large, where the wallet was removed far away from her body. So I took up some money to treat my friend to movies. And that evening came home in time for dinner, and she said to me, "Next time, ask, never steal." So I learned my lesson. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Donna. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Helen. Back to you, Chloe.
Thank you, Fong. Thank you, Chloe.
Thank you, Chloe.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing conversation. And we are just so thankful to have had you all here today to talk so generously about these subjects with all of us. So it's a tradition at the Rail to end our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Suchi Jennifer Pritchard, to the stage. New York Hornby Island-based writer and visual artist Suchi Jennifer Pritchard is presently at work on a Bildungsroman manuscript exploring the settling of supersized malls and identities formed while searching for the sublime amidst the necropastoral of eroding public space. A longtime student of silent monk Baba Haridas, and more currently a student of Vipassana meditation in the tradition of Ajahn Tong, Suchi is delighted to join this conversation.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And I'm especially grateful because I'm living at a rural Vipassana center right now that doesn't have Wi-Fi. So I'm at the Ford's Cove General Store, which is why there was a little challenge with getting the Zoom to work. Okay, I wrote this poem this morning after my sit, and it is so interesting to have just heard this conversation about no self and the social action that meditation actually can be. And that's really what I'm trying to question and learn about at this time. So I call this It and I. Between the world and me, a reciprocity. Some heart shed gladness, beleaguered ego like such sullied wet coins thrown into a fountain as wishes, bowing, sitting, walking. I unsearch or seek non-self in return these shiny wet coins to a shifting world as it is in that moment, as it surrounds me and I it. So that was just this morning, jotted down. So now reading from a manuscript called Object Permanence, sort of exploring that mall and intimacy and interpersonal as in eroding social space. So this is called an untenable referent. It is passing. Tenants in the sky change lease. Hang from the sun, a better shade. Untenable referent. Been duped again. I mistook a length of feathers for wing. Turn past the sun again. Is it passing? Is awe effervescent? Inhabiting a song has made me bashful. Notes accumulate and fill the upper left corner of a couplet. Tears appreciate in value when held for release at opportune moments. Holding the mirror makes me forget the future. My lines mar a perfect childhood. Air gulped in like I have never been here before everything became an accumulation. It was called something for everyone. It was a party. It was called something for everyone. It was pink, almost red and chemical. It was lost between the upholstery. Plush values, plastic covered, empty. It was over. A birthing, most uncomfortable, accompanying birdsong played, backwards, garbled, beautiful, an unarchived collection in wide lens view. It wasn't seen in memory. It was peripheral. 2 cassettes in a box prove what was, or drawing on the surface of water takes the shape of air. Our costumes sleeping, seemingly limbless marsupials take the shape of pillows, take the shape of feathers without wing, birds without branches. Wishes take the shape of many things. Our mattress takes the shape of us, our sleep to surrender what is not, our dream to remember the shape inside of air. The air takes the shape of humidity, its indent and sag, the scent of fresh yeast rise while waiting for the overnight. And from, again, the Object Permanence Mall manuscript, the sound designer sketches. Our nerves evaporate in sim sunlight. We become more ether than object. Been waiting, billboard-like, to be a part of an updraft in aerial perspective. Moss would be most missed. In the middle of the mall, a sundial sat in as a persona poem, concerned more with duration than time. Concrete effects mimic some stone and antiquity foe, leaning angles unsure, not meant to tell. Demure, forgotten skirts, childhood spelling of incantations, a silver amulet thrown, sullied wet coins, begged or wished for, promises. Next, a placeholder for the photo of us holding hands. Is it shiny? Does it empty out like a balloon? A new pastoralism, post-MS, DOS, infographic, ribboned cherubim perch at the edge of clouds, repeating over the lycra weave stretchy pants. I watch the screen close. I want to ask if PowerPoint has instead a left branching fade out function, or more precisely, can things fade backwards? Remembered lake, lake, I think of you. I do not think of you. When I think of you, I do not think of Facebook or being 24. You, we mess around in our acid wash now that there's no more ice in the cooler, just water, floating cans, a few loose tabs. Is this impressionistic? A glacier logo slid off one of the bottles into the cooler. Is this memory recall? We've redressed, waiting for sunset in a biker jacket, 1995, or does the post say 96? Sorry, I can't write poetry now without other poets and posts. They're all stuffed in my head, fashioning material, like pockets bulging. Distressed denim over a new spandex bikini. The ties bunch up over the waistband, dusk, no longer neon against friendly tan. Was the sun less strong in the late 90s? Redress, we pull our hoodies over our heads. One last kokanee can amongst us. We share sips, shivering almost, while we laugh for the camera. The dock now in a northwest wind, wet hair, shivering a bit, means that tomorrow a slight sunburn will appear. Cold, too cold. Can't I write poetry without vanilla ice? I'm not supposed to break the tone of the poem, take you out, but everything takes me out. It's all shiny and moving in the foliage. Phenomenological tiger cascades across the dress. I won't by tomorrow. Make it stop. Now, here I clip the almost cut lines of this poem together, shivering a bit, back on the dock. Means that tomorrow the slight sunburn will appear. The sun less strong in the 90s, fashioning, collapse, some sort of distress. Collage, the vanilla ice lines I left out. A snapshot, holding hands. Horizontal, moving past me, emptying. Like landscape, grasses seed to. Vertices and plains, how I cling to your margins. I am between clouds. Between towers of glass, holding sky. These are the same windows, the same windowsills holding pigeon feathers, the same buildings, predictable in their ability to reflect light. Our foci curve, insert ellipsis graphs, look like faces. Look in a mirror, forget my future. This is the same window, the same holding. Insert the handheld items into the poem, onto the windowsill. A piece of jasper, the tiger eye you gave me. I will not burn my toast again, looking out the same window on 44th Street. Morning past me, like the electric plate of coffee maker. Holds heat to outlast its emptying. Sips. I ought to brush my hair, call my sister. Thank you. I have a twin, and so I call it the twin ship. It enters the poems often, especially because she's very neurotypical and I'm on the spectrum. And so I use her as an agent to help me enter the world. And again, this is where my meditation is trying to learn the social practice of being really with people and in the world in a way. So it's very helpful to hear parts of this dialogue today. Thank you so much to the Brooklyn Rail and everyone here. And thank you, Anselm, for asking me.
Thank you so much for those beautiful poems. And thank you again to Helen and Mark and Donna and this amazing conversation. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation, who sponsors our NSE program and makes daily conversations like these possible. Over the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has brought together art, music, dance, film, theater, literature, and thoughtful social and political meditations in our monthly publication and in our public events, like here on our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support our writers, editors, and operations here at the Rail. And tomorrow at 1 p.m., we have a conversation with Lola Montez Schnabel and Patrick Reed on the event of Faccio D'Angelo, Every Angel Has Another Face at Nino Meyer Gallery in Los Angeles. And we'll conclude with a poetry reading then as well. We encourage you to join us, and you can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you leave.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you, Donna.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful coach.
Thank you, Helen.
Really good.
Incredible.
Thank you, Helen.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Mark.
Great
Thank
poetry
you,
too. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Fang.
Yes. Bye, Mark. Can't wait to see you.
Great
And
to see
Ali.
you. Great to see
Great
you.
to see you. I know. Bye, Helen. Thank you. Thank you,
Bye.
Donna.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank
So
you.
long now.
Bye.
Bye.